Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Alex from the team here at NQA, and I'm very pleased to introduce the first in our special four-part webinar series on the journey to carbon neutrality, step by step, with our associate partners Auditel. The series is going to be taking a focused look at each of the four stages of the carbon neutrality standard PAS 2060. And I'm very pleased to welcome carbon solution specialist Gavin Miller and Sean Connaughton, who will be presenting today on step one of the journey, which is titled How to Measure Your Carbon Footprint to Become Verified Carbon Neutral. The session is going to run for approximately 45 minutes, and there'll be time at the end for a Q&A. So if you would like to submit a question, you can do so in the chat box, and we'll try to ensure as many are addressed as possible. And we'll be recording this session and circulating it after the event. And for anyone who would like a copy of the slides, they'll be made available as well in that same email on Monday. So with that bit of housekeeping out of the way, I'm going to hand over to Gavin and Sean, and I hope you will enjoy.
That's great. Thanks very much, Alex, and welcome everybody. It's Friday. It's 2 o'clock. Hopefully the sun is shining where you are. Hopefully we've all got great weekends to look forward to. And in the meantime, let's progress with the journey to carbon neutrality step by step. I'm Gavin Miller, and I'm joined by Sean Connaughton today, and we're going to go through that first step of a carbon footprint program, which is the report, the measurement, and how do we get there. Okay, so we're going to go through organizational emissions impact on the environment. What does that mean? We're going to look at understanding the scopes of 1, 2, and 3. We're quite mindful that the audience here this afternoon may be on different parts of the journey, so some of you may have much more knowledge than others, but we'll kind of keep it kind of general in terms of what we can produce. We'll also look at the data, what data is required and how to collect it, and we're also looking at data analysis to establish that carbon footprint. Okay, so before we delve into the detail, and Sean's going to take us through the detail of PAS 2060 and the carbon footprint measurement process itself, let's just kind of look at our kind of journey. And as Alex said, this is the first in a series of 4. We'll also be looking at targeting and reduction and verification webinars over the coming days and weeks. And the focus of today obviously is around measurement, but it's all part of the journey. So where the objective is for you as a business, and depending on where you are on your journey in terms of targeting, setting emission targets, reduction emission targets, verification, it all needs to start with the data, the report. So we go through the process of appraisals, mapping, modeling, analyzing, and clearly coming up with a report in order to then be the benchmark, the baseline in order to reduce emissions going forward. So as part of that then, the appraisal process, it's about understanding your company or activities. We'll also be looking at aligning your business activities with scope 1, 2, and 3. When it comes to the modeling stage, it gets quite tricky and can get quite complex around understanding the data, accessibility data, accuracy of the data. So we really want to make sure that the conversion factors are correct, the methodology is correct, that we're aligned with GHG protocol. And around that, of course, we'll also potentially producing company surveys as well to help us with the analysis. That analysis bit supported by the evidence and guided by PAS 2060 framework, and that's what we're also going to talk about today. Just a couple of extra points here around this is that first stage of it. If you haven't already started, it's a really good idea to get visibility and understanding of your purchase ledger, because in your purchase ledger, you'll get an understanding of your cost and spend, but you'll also get an understanding and visibility of your suppliers, which you're going to need. The second part is around savings, that bar at the bottom. So all the way through the process of carbon management planning, there's always an opportunity potential for savings. Much of that the focus will be in webinar 2 and 3, but just right up front, it's thinking about, well, what savings potentially can we make? Because that first stage of data capture analysis is the heavy lifting. It's fairly low investment. It's going to be fairly low investment. Okay, so let's move on to the next bit. So this is something else to think about. So it's not the focus of today, but we would kind of encourage all business just to think about the extended benefits and value of undertaking a carbon assessment. We're talking about the carbon assessment today. We're talking about measurement today. And the rest of this series, we'll be talking about reduction and verification. But actually, there's a lot of value for you in your business and your organization and your teams to think about the wider landscape of sustainability, the knowledge, training and development and learning you and your teams are going to get by undertaking a carbon assessment program. The role of innovative design, planning, technologies in helping you facilitate a sustainable business will play a part in the progress of your business. The potential to rewire your business through the value chain and your supply chain. So new business models, be they procurement, supply chain, raw materials, end-of-life product, all those bits may come out of actually undertaking a carbon assessment. So you're going to get much more benefit, much more value, wider value by undertaking this carbon assessment beyond the core of what it's going to deliver. And lastly, around strategic marketing. And what we find working with a number of clients is, if you get the data right, if it's accurate and you've got a story to tell, it's a really great opportunity to minimize your risk around greenwashing. Great stories to tell. So there's something additional to think about, not the focus of today, but the wider benefits of sustainability by undertaking a carbon assessment report. Okay, so around that, we've all seen the United Nations Sustainability Development Goals. So we're the bottom left, number 13, climate action. So climate action is one of the 17 UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's the focus of today's session around that measurement piece, but actually none of us could ignore the wider impact of sustainability in our organizations. So it's something to be mindful of. Again, not the focus today, but something to be mindful of in the wider landscape. Okay, so let's move forward and look at then the impact on the environment, the context. And many of you will be aware of the context. So the goal out of the Paris Agreement is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees, preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius, and compared to pre-industrial levels. And as we know, the contributors to the greenhouse gas emissions are focused around 7 core emission gases: carbon dioxide, HFCs, methane, NF3, nitrous oxide, PFCs, and sulfur hexafluoride. All those pieces that Sean's going to talk about in a minute, because we're going to need to find a way to understand the emissions that we're producing as business and how we convert it back into a carbon equivalent benchmark as part of our carbon footprint report. Okay, so we're all aware of this. So sunlight warms the earth, the greenhouse effect helps keep part of this heat in the atmosphere. The challenge is, a polluted earth traps more heat in the atmosphere, and actually a clean earth lets more heat escape. So us as businesses, we've got a clear direction to go, which is how do we contribute to making the planet cooler? So, each day new emissions are enhancing the greenhouse effect, whether it's agriculture, waste, vehicles, factories, buildings, commuting, travel, all of those increase and contribute to emissions. And we need to find a way to reduce the level of emissions. And as businesses, because all of our business activities and day-to-day operational activities have an impact on the environment. So how do we reduce it? Okay. So very quickly, if we look at the sources of human-made gas emissions, so there are direct and indirect sources. So 1/4 of those emissions are from burning fossil fuels, which we use for power and heat. Agriculture and forestry make up another 1/4. Other sources come from transport, buildings, industry, and wider. So this gives you a sense then in terms of your business, and whether you started that journey or not, is where do those emissions come from? Because we're going to need to understand where those emissions come from in order to get a very robust carbon footprint report. Okay. So the journey to net zero, and again, mindful of you may be on different part of that journey, whether you started or whether you're in the middle of it or well on the way to achieving carbon neutrality, is all business activities contribute to global warming. And here we've kind of put them into the buckets, the GHG scope 1, 2, and 3. So whether that's company facilities, whether it's company vehicles in scope 1, whether it's electricity, use of steam in your buildings for scope 2. And scope 3 is where invariably this is where the complexity lies, is where most of your emissions will sit and fit, whether it's employee commuting, capital goods, business travel, purchase goods and services, both upstream and downstream. So the point here is, as a business and organization, it's back to that appraisal bit, is what activities have you got in the business? How are they aligned to each scope? What are those sources of emissions? Okay. So Sean's going to delve into the detail next, but that last piece is around terminology. And I don't think any of us are really clear around terminology. There's lots of grey lines and blurring lines, but what broadly does carbon neutral mean? In fact, it means balancing gas GHG emissions by offsetting, or removing from the atmosphere an equivalent amount of carbon for the amount produced. So we produced emissions, we offset, that's carbon neutral. Net zero is reached when the amount of CO2 is emitted is matched by the quantity of CO2 removed. But actually the challenge here is you can't achieve net zero by offsetting. And the area of offsetting is we're going to follow up in the next couple of webinars around definitions of offsetting and how do you approach offsetting. And the final part is net zero carbon. So that means there's no CO2 being emitted for an organization. Actually, that's not really possible yet, but obviously lots of investments going behind technology. So that gives you a rounded view of environment and context. And now over to Sean, who's going to talk about Path 2060 and delve into the detail around a carbon footprint and how do you produce it.
Thanks, Gavin, and thank you, Gavin, for setting the scene there. What I'm looking to do and hope to do for you people today as well is to look at Path 2060 and the first stage, which is defining and measuring our carbon footprint. Now, Path 2060, like most standards, when you first read it, can appear complex, quite technical, so we're going to try and simplify a lot of it and put it into layman's terms for us all today. But what I want to look at first is some of the reasons behind why we have nailed our flag to the Path 2060 mast at Auditel. There's a number of reasons here that appear on the screen that we believe is the right standard to be working towards. It clearly sets out a standard for carbon neutrality claims, and by reading the Path 2060 and following the standard, you are going to achieve carbon neutrality, verified carbon neutrality that has been validated and verified by third party. Yes, it allows for your own self-certification. However, we would always advise to go for third party independent verification, because that is going to mitigate any chance of you actually being accused of greenwashing. It means that all the data that you have collected has been verified and validated by third party. And also one of the other reasons we like about Path 2060 is it does not allow or make provision for a declaration of carbon neutrality solely through offsetting. So it means you can't buy your way out of a problem. You need to continually be reducing your emissions on an ongoing basis. Gavin spoke earlier about the 7 main greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. And rather than actually organisations reporting in each of these gases individually, it has been agreed that the best way to do it, and that's why we talk about carbon footprinting. So when you talk about carbon footprint or carbon reduction, we're actually talking about all the greenhouse gases in total. And what happens is each greenhouse gas has got what's called a global warming potential, and that's relative to the equivalent unit of carbon dioxide. Now, carbon dioxide is the most abundant of the greenhouse gases, and that's why it's used for carbon reporting. But to give you some context, 1 tonne of methane emits the same amount or has the same global warming potential as 1 tonne of methane is equivalent of 25 tonnes of carbon dioxide. 1 tonne of nitrous oxide is equivalent of 298 tonnes. So when you're doing your carbon footprint, you're actually covering all greenhouse gases, but you're then converting everything back to what is called a tonne of CO2 equivalent. And we'll talk about that quite a bit during the next couple of webinars. So over and above the kind of obvious benefit of becoming verified carbon neutral, and that it's going to help the planet and it's going to help mankind, there's a number of tangible benefits that businesses should actually be also considering when we're actually looking at carbon neutrality. First and foremost, it's going to help you win business. More and more now we see that a lot of tender requirements that are put out by the public and private sector are asking for a carbon footprint or a carbon reduction plan to be part of your tender process. We're seeing it within construction, particularly around about publicly funded construction projects, whether that's a school or a hospital, social housing. We see it in food and drink. All the major supermarkets over the past 18 months have been in communication with all the suppliers, basically setting out what they see as expectations from the supply chain for the coming 12, 24, 36 months. And they're all looking for the suppliers to start addressing their carbon emissions. They're looking for them to have a carbon footprint. They're also looking for them to have a carbon reduction plan. Now, nobody's saying that if they don't abide with that, they're going to be delisted, but we are all interlinked in this. Now, a supplier to a customer, you're part of their supply chain, you're part of their scope 3. So the more that you can do for your customers, the better it is for you as well. And as I say, it's helping your own customers on their own journey to net zero. As part of that supply chain in scope 3, if you can actually demonstrate to your customers that you're verified carbon neutral, that's going to stand you in a higher light than another potential supplier to them who isn't. We're also seeing it with government contracts. In fact, last year, the government released a new public policy notice, 06-21, which came into effect in September. Now, all government contracts over £5 million annual value must have a carbon reduction plan in place, or the tender goes no further. Now, that £5 million value will start to drop to 3 million and 1 million. And from what we're hearing, it looks as if it could be all public contracts from 2025 should have a carbon reduction plan in place. So it's best to start your planning now. Other benefits is around about staff recruitment and retention. There is a whole raft of people out there who have heavily bought into this agenda, and they're now actually choosing who they wish to work for based on that company's ESG policies, based on their green credentials, or their ethics and values. Now, if you're not doing something about it, that's a talent pool that you could be losing out on, not also to your competitors. So there's benefits to your staff. Regulation. Now, there's a number of regulations been brought in by the government over the past 6-7 years, including ESOS, SECR, MEIS. Now, the information that you gather and calculate for your carbon footprint is also similar to the data that is required for your obligation under ESOS and SECR. So it means you're not doing the job twice. So it's helping you actually gather that information. And the other thing that could be coming at some point in the future is carbon taxes. So if we can actually be ahead of the game and start to record and report our carbon, we're ready when this actually happens. Other things to consider is about your suppliers. As Gavin said at the start, there's a lot of cost savings in this, and we firmly believe at Auditel that cost reduction and carbon reduction go hand in hand. You're going to actually have improved supplier relationships because you're going to be communicating with your suppliers on a more regular basis. You're going to be asking them about their carbon output. You're also going to be communicating with them about how you can both actually improve in that and maybe collaborating on some innovation. So as you can see, there's a number of tangible benefits from actually starting to record your carbon footprint on your journey to becoming carbon neutral. Now, I want to focus now on the process for Past 2060. And the first thing any organisation should look to do is actually to set your goals for what you want to achieve. Now, for every company or every organisation, it's going to be a different journey. But the first thing we should be looking to do is set a task force or a project team who's actually going to set the goals for what we're trying to achieve. And that shouldn't just be made up of a team from the senior management team. We want people from the shop floor, from production, from sales, from HR. We want a mix and a balance of people and balance of views. Now, those people that you pull together, they're going to become your internal champions, your green champions, your ambassadors, who are actually going to share with their peers the reasoning behind what we're trying to achieve and what it is we're trying to achieve and the benefits to the organisation as a whole. So once you've set your goals, that's when we're actually then starting to look at what we need to do on the Past 2060. So within PASS 26, the first thing we need to look to is identify the entity. We then determine the subject. We're going to quantify the carbon footprint using recognised methodology. We'll develop a carbon reduction plan, and we'll make a declaration of commitment to carbon neutrality. From there, we will take action to reduce our carbon footprint. We'll offset any residual emissions, and then we'll go for third-party verification from an organisation such as NQA. Now, that first part, to identify which part of the business needs to be included. An entity can be a regional or local government, it could be a community, it could be a business, it could be part of a business, or it could be a brand, it could be a group of companies. So once you identify which entity it is, it's understanding the subject. Now, the subject for measurement could be its activities, it could be its products and services, it could be a site, it could be an event or a product. But for most of us on this webinar, it's probably going to be that the entity and the subject could be the same. It could be our business as the entity and the business as the subject, or it could be the group as the entity and one of the businesses as the subject. Once we've identified that, we then set our application period, and that is our reporting period. So the period and time that we're actually going to do a report for. Now, that could be a calendar year, it could be a financial year, it could be over 2 years. But bear in mind, and what's important is when you set your application period at the start, it needs to be consistent. So if you're doing it over a 2-year period, you'll be reporting every 2 years. If you're doing it in a calendar year, you're reporting on calendar years. For most of the clients we've been working with, the calendar year seems to be the preferred way of going forward for an application period. You're then setting your methodologies. So methodology is the framework that you're going to use to deliver the evidence required to substantiate your declaration of carbon neutrality according to PASS 2060. So the first thing we need to do, and Gavin briefly spoke about the different scopes, is identify from your own business where you are creating emissions. Now, as we've said, that they come in 3 different scopes. Scope 1 is your direct emissions. That is the emissions that we create going about our day-to-day business from controlled and owned sources. So that could be your company facilities, your buildings, your sites, your offices, company vehicles, your production processes. These are all part of Scope 1. Scope 2 is indirect emissions from generated energy from elsewhere. And for the majority of companies in the UK, that is going to be electricity only. And everything else goes into Scope 3. So that's your downstream and your upstream, your value chain and your supply chain. So that covers everything from, as Gavin was saying, your purchases through capital goods, your business travel, your distribution upstream and downstream, all the way through to the use of your sold products. Now, to satisfy the conditions of PASS 2060, we must include 100% of Scope 1 emissions, 100% of Scope 2 emissions, and a subset of Scope 3. And by subset, it's not a case of you get to choose. It's what's relevant to your business and what you can actually gather data on. Now, ideally, all data initially should be primary data. If primary data is not available, then it should be secondary. If you do need to use estimates under PASS 2060, and I'm going to read this out, it's just to ensure that you understand, where estimates of greenhouse gas emissions are used in the quantification of the subject carbon footprint, particularly associated with Scope 3, these shall be determined in a manner that precludes underestimation. Any Scope 1, 2 and 3 emission source estimated to be material, i.e. more than 1% of the total carbon footprint, shall be taken into consideration unless evidence can be produced to demonstrate that such quantification would not be technically feasible, practicable or cost effective. So that's a case of, if the data is available, it needs to be included. You will not get away with saying, we don't want to measure that because it's too difficult to do so. Now, once you understand where your company is creating emissions from, one of the exercises we do with clients is to do an actual scope and boundary mapping exercise. So in this sample I'm going to show you, we've got an organisation that's got a factory, they've got a warehouse, they've got some offices. So what we would do with this, the project team is start by saying, right, let's look at our factory and let's go all the way back in our supply chain. So where their component parts come from, where their raw materials come from, how do they get here? Do they travel by land? Is it, by road, rail? Do they come in containers? Are they shipped by air freight? By doing so, you're starting to get a picture of your whole supply chain, where your emissions could be coming from and where could they be created. Once they get to the factory, what happens there? So there might be gas involved. So it might be gas for heating, it might be gas for some production processes. There's going to be electricity. There may be diesel. Diesel could be for generators, it could be for some of your company vehicles, and petrol. So you then start to get a picture and drawing up of the emissions and where they're actually being created. Business travel, employees commuting. So all of a sudden we now start to see what is going into the factory. Similar with the warehouse, we then start to go back all the way. So that could be goods that are there for purchase and resale. So where did the goods come from? What are we purchasing? Who are they from? How do they arrive at our premises? What happens when they get to our premises? What happens when they leave our premises? What happens when they get to our customers? Now, by doing this mapping exercise, we start to get a clear understanding and picture of where any emissions from our business could come. And once we understand where the emissions have been created, the next step then is about data collection. Now, data from our activities are going to come from a number of sources, even internally. Now, internally, they could come from your finance department, they could come from logistics, they could come from warehousing, they could come from HR, they could come from procurement. Externally, they're going to come from our suppliers. But it's understanding what data is required and how we're going to collect that data. Once we've got the data collected, it's then a case of we're then going to start to measure that data. Now, I'm going to show you some examples of what we look to do. So in this example here, we're looking at fleet. So on fuel for fleet, what we're actually looking to try and gather is the consumption of fuel that's been used within that reporting period. Now, in this sample, we're looking at diesel vehicles, petrol vehicles. What we're looking for is how many litres were we actually consumed in each month of the reporting period for each site or for each vehicle. Once we've got that, we can actually total that up, and that's given us a picture of the consumption that we had in the reporting period for the litres of diesel or litres of petrol or LPG or propane or whatever it is. Now, this type of information is probably going to come from invoices, or it could be, if you've got fuel cards, it can be from transactional downloads. Now, any of that data that we have and the evidence must be kept, because that forms part of our evidence pack for verification, which my colleague Hugh will talk to you about in series number 4 of the webinar. So as you can see from that sample, taking your fuel consumption for a year starts to build up the picture of where you're actually starting to see some figures. Similarly, we could take our electricity. So electricity, what we're looking for again is the consumption per site or per meter or per sub-meter during that reporting period. Now, this is where carbon reporting and financial reporting start to vary a bit. If you take the same invoice that you get in for your electricity, finance are looking at the net amount, the VAT, and the gross amount. That's irrelevant in carbon reporting. What we're looking at is what was your previous meter reading, what is your current meter reading, and what is your consumption during that period. And as you can see from the graphs and tables, it's about then building up that picture on a month-to-month basis, your consumption for electricity for each of your sites, each of your meters, to come up with some total usage. Another example could be your water and your waste. So again, it's not about the cost, it's about consumption. How much water came in, how much went out. Your waste removal, we're looking there about tonnage. So how many tonnes were sent to general waste, to landfill, or to dry mixed recycling? There's different emissions factors for each of those. So we've got to separate and segregate that information and that data. So the more information you have, the more accurate that picture becomes. Other areas we can be looking at is your business travel. Now, in business travel, that's drilling down into things like rail, taxi, hotel stays, your grey fleet, your flights. And the complexity here is that a domestic flight has got a different emissions factor from a short haul or a long haul, so an international. So we need to be recording this type of information. Once you've got the information, again, it's then about totaling that information and actually presenting it back as totals for each of those subject matters. Similarly, downstream transport and distribution. So your distribution, we're then looking at each consignment in or out of our premises, the weight, the miles it's travelled. So this could be contained in your freight forwarders logs. It could be that this is the type of information that your logistics department's got hold of. But again, it's pulling all this information and data available to start to aggregate it, so that for each of our scopes, scope 1, scope 2, and as many categories in scope 3, we start to build up a picture of our consumption within that reporting period. Once the data has been collected, the next stage that we need to actually do is, and I've said earlier, you're going to hear a lot of, is convert it back to tons of CO2 equivalent. And the way we start to do that, as you can see from this sample, is that what we've started to do is we've identified the source of all our emissions. We've identified the scope it's in, the units it's been measured in, and the total units of consumption during that reporting period. The next column then is their conversion factor. Now, the conversion factors in the UK are usually released by DEFRA and BASE. For certain other materials, there may be other conversion factors that you wish to use, but you must have full transparency on your conversion factors, so that when you actually go for verification, the verifier can see where the data came from, the evidence to prove where that data came from, and the conversion factors you have used to actually convert it into initially probably kilograms of CO2 equivalent, and eventually into tons of CO2 equivalent. And you can see in this example, what we've started to do is for each site, we're building up a tonnage of CO2 that this business is responsible for and emitting during that reporting period. Once we do that, we'll then start to formulate our carbon footprint. Now, carbon footprint, as you can see, is not just a number. There's a lot of data that goes into it, a lot of evidence is gathered. There's a number of calculations to actually arrive at that footprint report. So in this example, again, we're looking at the scopes, what the tonnage of CO2 was, and you see in this example, this business has created 4,319 tons of CO2 in the reporting period. That is their absolute figure. Now, an absolute figure, if you're a growing company and you're expanding, opening new premises, producing new products, your absolute figure in the short term may rise. So to actually counter that, what we should also be looking at doing is setting intensity metrics. Now, intensity metrics in this example, we have looked at intensity metrics per square metre premises. We've looked at a tonne of CO2 equivalent per £1 million turnover. We've also done it per employee. You could do it per widget or per tonne of product produced. Whatever is most relevant to your business, you start to set those intensity metrics. And you may find that in the short to medium term, if you are growing, your absolute footprint's going up. However, as long as you can see your intensity metrics are actually reducing, you know you're on the right trajectory. Other ways of measuring is by scope, by tonnage, and by percentage. And by doing this, you start to identify areas that could be for concern or hotspots. And if you see in this example, 89% of their carbon emissions comes from scope 3. And if we drill back to the table on the left-hand side, we can see the majority of that comes from business travel and downstream transportation and distribution. That allows the organisation to actually start looking at those areas that we should be looking to see what we can do to actually reduce our emissions from there. Once you have actually done that, that's when you're at the stage that we are then now looking at identifying the hotspots and devising a carbon reduction strategy. Now, that carbon reduction strategy, my colleague David McDonald is going to be following up with the next webinar in this series, which I believe is on Tuesday. So that's been a whistle-stop tour of your emissions and what actually goes into the carbon footprint. We're going to open it up the panel to questions. But before we do that, I'd just like to remind you of the other 3 webinars in this series. So on Tuesday, 10th of May, we've got David McDonald presenting on carbon management planning. On Friday, the 20th of May, we have Mark Miller presenting on carbon offsets and credits. And finally, the last webinar in the series is my colleague Hugh Williams, who will be presenting on verification. So I'd just like to thank you for joining us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and open up the panel, and my colleague Rob Allison is going to actually start taking questions from us.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you, Gavin, for a fantastically insightful whistle-top tour of the first stage of PAS 2060. We've got a few questions that have come in during the webinar. The first one I'd put to Sean. Maybe this one would be directed more at yourself. This one here, isn't the upstream transportation and distribution a service paid for by the reporting company? Could you explain the difference between upstream and downstream distribution, please?
Upstream distribution is anything coming from our suppliers to ourselves. So if you're a manufacturing plant, it could be that is your goods and services coming into your processing plant, and downstream is your distribution of those finished goods and services to your customers, and both need to be included, both are scope 3. Now, what we're now starting to see is in downstream distribution, some of the major couriers are now actually starting to go through verified carbon neutrality, and some of them are doing it to PAS 2060, and they have a verification. They've made their explanatory notice that they are certified verified carbon neutral, which means that any journey that they have done on your behalf does not need to be counted by you as part of your scope 3, because it's already been counted.
Excellent. Thank you, Sean. That's a really interesting point. Gavin, just to keep things balanced, I'll field the next one to yourself if I can. I'm a retailer of office furniture. Do I have to include the carbon used to produce the goods that I'm selling, as well as the transportation to our warehouse and again out to the customer's premises?
That's a great question, and it's a complicated one too, in the sense that if you don't have access to the data of embedded carbon, for example, in your furniture goods, then you can't then include it as part of your measurement. But as part of the process and the journey, we would always encourage you to kind of look at and work with your suppliers and collaborate to determine of your products what carbon emissions are in there. So the answer is necessarily no, but actually as part of the journey, and to achieve PAS 2060 verification, and especially where you need to look at what emissions are coming out of those categories, at some stage you will need to understand and determine what carbon is coming through those products and services.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Thank you, Gavin. Just playing ping pong between the two of you then, so back to you, Sean. How would you expect to set a goal at the outset before you've actually begun to measure?
I think for each organisation there's a different reason, but ultimately we're all on the same journey. The destination for every organisation is net zero, but that's 20, 25, 30 years away for most of us. But it's understanding why you're starting this journey. Now, some organisations, it may be because of a tender, that they have been approached by a potential client that they need to actually start measuring their impact. Others, it could be that they have taken it, they believe it's the right ethical thing to do. For each organisation, it's going to be a different reason. I had one company recently who are going through to full verification, and the managing director said that, you know, the reason he was going on the journey, yes, he believed he was doing the right thing for the planet and for his children and his grandchildren. However, he also saw it as a commercial benefit, in that he said that once he is verified as carbon neutral, the first thing he's going to go and do is tell every one of his customers. The second thing he's going to do is go and tell every one of his competitors' customers, because that then gives him a massive competitive advantage over them. So it's different reasons for different companies.
Yeah, and I guess there's probably an important distinction there between, and maybe I didn't articulate the question. I think those are all great motivators or reasons to do it. Your actual goal relative to environmental improvement, it can't be set until you've measured. Is you can't manage what you can't measure, is the adage I think that Sean used earlier or Gavin used. So to the person asking the question, Stephen, there, yeah, you can't set a goal until you start measuring.
Your goals, Rob, would come at that second stage. You know, once we understand, you know, what our carbon emissions are, our carbon footprint. If we take the example that we are creating 1,000 tonnes, at that second stage that David will go into on Tuesday, it may be that you're going to set yourself short, medium and long-term goals. Your long-term goal is going to be net zero. And if we go by the definition of net zero, that's to reduce your emissions from where they currently are by 90% by your target date. But your short term may be to reduce your scope 1 by 50% by 2030, and your scope 2 by, say, 50% by 2030, and your scope 3, depending on each category and the information that you know, may have different targets. But ultimately, it's about setting short, medium and long-term goals, but also having the flexibility to be able to change them.
Okay, thank you. That small, quick operational question here from Eleanor King. Did you say that there was a threshold for public sector contracts to require a published reduction strategy? It's going to reduce?
Yes. PPN 0621 came out last June by the UK government that all government contracts with a value of £5 million annually or over must have a carbon reduction plan. That came into effect in September. So at the moment it is, yes, 5 million. Now, some companies out there might think we don't go for contracts over 5 million. You might not, but one of your customers may, and you're part of their supply chain. So they may still come back and ask you what you're doing about your carbon emissions.
I think just to add on that, the PPN 0621 is where it refers to providing a carbon reduction plan. In the next part of the series, the team will kind of focus on that. In order to come up with a carbon reduction plan, you need a carbon footprint report. So that's the critical piece of the jigsaw too.
Okay, but just to be clear for the listeners' sake, we did refer earlier. There was a reference to a reduction in that threshold. That is the speculation within the sector. The yes, reduction will come as the screws are tightened, but it's not something that's published as yet.
No, that is speculation. Again, when and where it will be reduced to, we don't know at this moment in time.
Yeah. 5 million is the current threshold. Yeah.
Okay. I have a pilot testing unit in my laboratory, and I want to validate the energy and verify it. How can it be calculated, as the pumps work and heat inputs are variable depending on the work conditions, or as per work conditions? I mean, probably more of a technical operational question specific to the kit there. I don't know whether either of you can help on that.
I think that would be a question for our colleague Mark Miller, who's taking the third webinar.
Okay, well, if Mark is available to answer that one, we'll pick up the answer on that and circle back around to it then. This is a very good one here. What if your suppliers are international? This is something we encounter an awful lot, certainly with import and distribution manufacturer companies. But what if your suppliers are international and don't work to the same standards in order, or just don't measure their carbon, full stop? Gavin, would you like to field that one?
I seem to get all the complicated questions. I mean, it's possible to look. You need to look at your kind of value chain, supply chain, even if it's international. And I think the bit is that the kind of broad answer is this is a long journey. So actually, part of it is in order to get your suppliers to work to your standards. And by the way, PAS 2060 is an international standard. So you're taking the framework of PAS 2060 and frankly applying it to any market. So if that's your central framework of PAS 2060, it covers all international markets and supply chains. The critical bit is, and whether in your UK only or other, is the complexity in the supply chain. And given that I think it's something like 11 times more emissions occur in scope 3 than they do in 1 and 2, that's going to be in your supply chain. So we would say encourage all companies to work with their supply chain. collaborate, understand, set the benchmarks, the reasoning, the rationale, what's required, the data. It's not a kind of overnight achievement. It takes a while. So in the first instance, we would say if your supply chain isn't where you don't have kind of direct control or around kind of data, is work with them to produce it. Although in other instances where we've got UK-based companies we work with, you know, they'll often have the data themselves in terms of invoicing, shipping, transport data, mileage, all of those things as well. But I guess the critical bit is you've got to sit down, work out what those goals are, what you need, what data you need, how to get it to ensure that you come up to standard. Because if you don't reach that standard, then PAS 2060 won't allow you then to become verified as part of that framework.
Yeah. Okay, excellent, Gavin. And sorry, I definitely wasn't focusing tougher questions at you. It's just trying to balance the questioning. But I think one of the elements I always say, and I think this is relevant to everybody on the call, is when it comes to asking your suppliers those questions, there will be an awful lot of those suppliers who stare back blankly at you or don't respond or are in markets where they're not experiencing the same pressures or considerations we are. But that doesn't mean that we're not doing the right thing by asking the question. And the more we ask it of every supplier we've got, the more the noise is created, the more the demand is created, and the more pressure ripples through everybody's supply chain, wherever they are in the world, to start accounting for their emissions. And we're certainly seeing that with the increase in EPDs and other types of product-based life cycle analysis that's occurring to meet these requirements. But it's a really good question. So we've got quite a few more coming in. I'm trying to keep up. What is the best source of emission factors if I'm using a spend-based methodology? Sean, if you'd like to tackle that one for us.
We don't use spend analysis. There are softwares out there that use spend analysis. I think there is online, is it Qantas, I believe, if you're using spend analysis. But when we're doing our carbon footprint from our clients, we're looking at primary data first, secondary data, and trying to avoid spend analysis if possible.
Okay. And again, touch on this one was targeted at you. Sean, it says, Sean, you said that if a shipping company which distributes your products has measured their scope 1 and 2 operational emissions, there will be no need to include those in your scope 3 upstream, downstream transportation. But isn't this the point? Their scope 1 and 2 emissions become your scope 3.
No, what I said is there's a number of couriers out there, DPD being one of them, who are verified carbon neutral for all of their distribution. So they have been through PAS 2060, they have identified the emissions that they create in every delivery they make, and have then offset the relevant amount with certified offsets. So their deliveries are carbon neutral. So if you're using DPD for your delivery and you've got their verification certificate, you do not need to include any deliveries you made using them within your carbon footprint.
For the purpose of PAS 2060 verification.
You know, what we want to avoid is double counting. You know, you don't want two organisations counting the same emissions.
Yeah, and that leads on pretty much to cover the next question we've got there. One of the other questions that came to mind is, I mean, when it comes to this first stage of PAS 2060, the creation of a meaningful and accurate footprint, what would you say in your practical experience with clients has been the biggest mistake you've seen entities make in the first instance, or the first assumption they've made when it comes to a footprint that maybe has been wrong? Gavin?
Do you mean in terms of the data or the process?
Overall, what's the most common mistake you see in carbon footprinting?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of mistake, assumption is that it's an easy process. and mindful of the audience on the call, whether it's a professional services business, a manufacturing business, etc. Organisation of different sizes. But I think what we find and what I found is that assumption is it's really easy. I think the other bit is around online calculators, and actually an online calculator can deliver my kind of data and output really easily and really quickly. The challenge, and hopefully you've seen today, is the thing that what Sean set out is accessing the data, accuracy of the data, company surveys you're doing, checking the data, authenticity. So less about kind of, I guess, mistake, but more around the assumption is it's quite an easy process. And actually it isn't, because if you want to do it really properly and you want to make sure that your data is accurate, authentic, right source, etc., you've really got to drill into the detail. And I think that surprises a lot of clients in terms of the detail that's required in order to do that. And not least with PAS 2060 as a framework, you need to get it right, because if you don't, the process of verification, internal auditors, NQA as an example, you won't get the verification. But the great thing is it's not, you don't have to do this by next Friday. It's a longer journey. We can take time, but the assumption being that you can do it quickly and with an online calculator, that assumption is often proved incorrect.
I think to add to that, I think one of the mistakes that some organisations make that I've seen is in interpreting the data. So if you take an energy bill, they may be taking, in a gas bill, they may be taking the kilowatt hours figure and then multiplying it by the cubic meters conversion factor. So it's ensuring that the data is being interpreted properly, you have taken the right figures, and you're then using the right conversion factor. Now, anybody who's seen the base conversion factor spreadsheets will understand that when you're reading lines and lines and lines of data, your eye can misinterpret or pick up from the cell above. So that's why that third-party verification, to me, is the most important part. Now, it means that the data is collected, it's verified, it's then, as an Auditel, we would then internally, somebody else verifies that data before it even gets to the external verifier. So it's ensuring that the data is correct, the conversion factors are correct, that everything is used is accurate. I think that's a common mistake, picking up the wrong information in the first place, putting it into a workbook, and then using the wrong conversion factor. And you can be out by counts of thousands when you do that.
Well, yeah, we've certainly seen it, haven't we, on a number of occasions. So thank you, Sean. Great. One other question here from Alan. How would you measure your water usage relative to your carbon footprint if your offices are in shared building environments with no separate water meter? I guess flow meter technology is sort of the answer there. Would you agree?
You could. If you're looking at just the invoices, you can't. The data is not there for you to actually accurately measure it. If you're still on a water invoice that's on rateable value, there is no accurate data there to say what your consumption is.
Okay, I think we've probably covered, looks like here we go. Sorry, system's not keeping up. We are a drinks company. Most suppliers don't have the details that we need for Cat 1 cradle to grave emissions. Would it be okay for us to use the data from one company as the basis for all, for example, to get the data from one brewery and then make that the assumption for all beer related products? I guess the basis being the subject to proxy data. Sean?
Personally, I would try to avoid it. Again, when it comes, if you're going to use estimations or proxy data, you need to clearly state your methodology for arriving at those figures. And it could be that you believe that methodology is accurate and correct. The verifier may have a different opinion.
Yeah, no, I think I think it's a good point, and Sean raised earlier around spend as well. The bit of, should you use spend, and Sean kind of saying actually wouldn't use spend. I think you certainly wouldn't use it in terms of getting to verification, etc., because it's not verifiable. But I think if in those instances where there are things missing, is in that instance, and that example is look at the proxy, just out of interest for your business and organisation, just to kind of try and give a sense or perspective of what that proxy might look like, that estimation. But the critical bit is we wouldn't advise then to take that forward for verification. So on the one hand, it's useful in terms of visibility and first look, just to get a sense, but we wouldn't recommend going down the route of kind of proxies and sort of open averages. Part of the objective here is, given that challenge, is okay, how do we work with our supply chain to collaborate and set the standards of requirements and goals and what we need to get the data? That is where we sit, is helping organizations through their supply chain collaborate, partner up in order to deliver that data.
Okay. Thank you. Okay, we're getting pretty close to time. There's a couple other questions here, so I'll just jump through a couple if I can. The question from one of the audience here: how do you measure home working or hybrid working? I'll just field that one. Within Auditel, the team have directly developed, Sean mentioned earlier, a methodology that can stand up to scrutiny. It involves a series of home worker surveys, counting the sort of office kit they've got at their disposal, then using some technical averages on energy consumption for that, judging what heating systems they've got at home and the percentage of time that heating would be on for when they're at home. There's a number of elements that would add up in that calculation. But it's about surveys, it's about interrogation and data collection, again, as the guys have already talked about. There are a couple of other questions. We are not going to get time, unfortunately, to address all of those today, because we are now just coming up with just 1 minute left to go. So it really is a wrap up. I would like to again thank both Sean and Gavin for their time today and their insights from their unique perspectives into PAS 2060 verification. I'd like to thank NQA for the opportunity for Auditel to provide some of this insight, and remind everybody that NQA will be forwarding out, probably on Monday now, given how close we are to the weekend, the recording, along with a link to be able to download the slides for those that are interested. Remind everybody again that we have the next event in this series on Tuesday, further details of which again can be booked via the NQA website. And other than that, it just leaves me to close the session. Thank you all very, very much for your time today. I hope you've enjoyed it.
Great, thank you.
Bye.